United States Air Force retired. Back in 1967, Bob was a missile launch officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. He says a UFO hovered over his nuclear missile site and disabled all the missiles.
And so, Carl, here's the million-dollar question. Do you believe that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet?
Right. So non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that.
Roswell, New Mexico is a quiet city of just 26,000 people. The majority of the population are ranchers or military.
And so, Carl, that is quite a bold statement. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, how confident are you that that is true?
There's zero doubt.
My name is Dale, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel, Observer of Anomalous Objects. Let me just say this. If you like that intro, I want to give a shout out to my good friend and filmmaker, Darcy Weir. He's the one who put that together. We're going to have a great podcast today. Let me go ahead and remind you, if you haven't done it already, you're not familiar with this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You can really help us get recognized with the YouTube algorithm by going ahead and hitting that share and like button. That would help us quite a bit. You know, death is the final frontier. Men like aerospace billionaire Robert Bigelow are spending millions of dollars trying to find out what happens after we die. There's another phenomenon known as the near-death experience. There are usually occasions where people have died and then they return back to their physical bodies. Today, I want to introduce a guest and author and also a podcaster by the name of Simon Bown. Before I mention Simon, though, let me go ahead and say this before I bring him on stage. Please let me read the biography for you. Simon Bown is the host of two influential podcasts. He's also a clinical hypnotherapist and an author specializing in topics related to consciousness, reincarnation, and the afterlife. He has produced over 800 podcast episodes, engaging with leading experts and scholars in the field of near-death experience, reincarnation, and the continuation of consciousness. His podcast, the Alien UFO Podcast and our Paranormal Afterlife, have collectively garnered over 6 million downloads. And our Paranormal Afterlife reached number 1 on the UK Apple Podcast spirituality chart. Simon holds a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy and is certified in past life regression therapy. He has conducted hundreds of past life regression sessions, specializing in guiding individuals through these therapeutic processes. His research is informed by personal experience with paranormal phenomena, including psychic flashes, UFO sightings, and other unexplained occurrences. These experiences have contributed to his academic interest in the nature of consciousness and its potential existence beyond the physical body. And so without any further ado, let me go ahead and bring Simon onto the stage. And Simon, I want to welcome you to the podcast. I want to thank you for being on the show. I'd like to start off by going ahead and having you tell people about your new book, Verified Near-Death Experiences, Proof of an Afterlife. And then you can also promote your two podcasts, if you don't mind.
Yeah, the book is 30 cases of near-death experiences where there's a verification event or events. So this could be something where basically an idea is somebody is on the operating table and they die, and they're hooked up to those devices, so they know the heart has stopped, the brain has flatlined, and there's the medical team rush around and they do all the resuscitation, all these different things different people are doing. And after the person's resuscitated, they can recount them all exactly what they all did while their brain was flatlined. And, by science, that's just impossible. I talked to a guy called Dr. Eben Alexander on my podcast, who was professor of neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. He said that it is impossible for a brain in that state to make and retain complex memories. But that's exactly what happens. And so my book is 30 cases like this, where I describe the whole near-death experience and then go through the verification events. And my two podcasts, the Alien UFO podcast, that's over 150 episodes. They're all an hour long interview. And then the other podcast is about 350 hour long interviews. I talk to people about near death experiences, reincarnation, past life regression, deathbed visions, mediumship, apparitions, all that sort of stuff. And with the Alien UFO podcast, I talk a lot about abduction, alien abduction, that side of things. I'm really interested in that. So not so much about disclosure and that side of things, more about sightings and experiences on that side. And they're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, just about every podcast app. I think they're on 30 podcast apps, each one of
Wow.
them. But I don't have a YouTube channel.
Okay. So everything but YouTube. I'm going to have to talk to you afterwards to find out about some of those places you're posting. So you talked about, abductions, you talked about past lives, you talked about near-death experiences. Do you think these things are all related, or they just happen to be there coexisting together?
Yeah, I think it's all related. There's all sorts of hints about this. There's a case in my book of a near-death experience, and there's a woman in this incredible landscape in the afterlife, and she can see to her left-hand side there's all these people there, and they're dressed in clothes from all eras of human civilization, and also some that look like they're from the future. But she also said there were some there that didn't even look human. And then she realized that these were all her past and future lives, and she
Oh,
could
wow.
sense a part of her soul in all of them. And then there's another side of things where in alien abduction, I've talked to a couple of people who've said they've complained against with the Greys and said to them, "You can't do this. You've got no right to do this to us." And the Greys say, "But you agreed to this before you were born." So the Greys must have some idea of the afterlife and communication with our soul or something. I've talked to a woman on my podcast, and she was a medium, but she had this experience one night. She woke up standing next to her bed, and there were four greys at the foot of her bed, which freaked her out. And then she looked around, and her body was in the bed. So she was having some kind of out of body experience. And that was such a shock for her that she slammed back into her body. She sat up, and the greys weren't there. So it seems like they were in that space that her consciousness could see when it was out of her body. So they may still have been in the room, but she couldn't perceive them. So you see all these little crossovers here and there and hints of things. And I talked to somebody the other day who had these greys in their room, and the greys said to them, "Where we come from, we don't have physical form. What you see of us is what you imprint upon us when we arrive with your subconscious. You see what you expect to see," or something like that. So it seems like those greys were coming from somewhere that is interdimensional or another reality. So it starts getting more complicated, doesn't it? The more you learn about this stuff, the more complicated it gets.
Well, I like that you said, some grays, because somewhere along the way, the image of a gray came from something physical that somebody saw. And then now maybe other people have seen that. And so they project themselves based on what people might be expecting. I've kind of seen that with some of the other people, especially when we're talking about UAPs and aliens or extraterrestrials, whatever you want to call them, where they seem to present themselves in a way that's comfortable to the person that they are presenting themselves to. And I look at Chris Bledsoe, and I know he thinks the woman is Mary. I have questions about that. And because there's other abductees that have seen the woman and they didn't think it was Mary. And I think it had to do with his own religious bias from being a Protestant Christian. And he thought that the aliens were all angels. But I think that they present themselves in a way that makes it easier for us to accept their their presence. Now, the other thing that you said I thought was interesting, because I've heard it at least one other time, and I know some abductees are going to have a problem with this, and I want to acknowledge that up front. But a friend, Steve Neal of Breaking the Silence channel, he told me that exact same thing, that he agreed to be abducted, to be taken. He doesn't like the word abducted, obviously, to be an experiencer, I guess is a better way of saying it, in a previous life, that he agreed, that he came to this life and agreed for these things to happen. So I find it interesting that the lady you talked to basically said the same thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this comes together. It's like when I take people through past life regression, and I've done hundreds of sessions with people, I've had a small number that go to past lives on other planets. So it seems to me that we may be incarnating in all sorts of places. And there is a thing that seems a bit too woo for me, a bit too far, about the Pleiadians. Maybe they incarnate in human bodies to do certain things. But you never know what's going to come up with this, and it gets so complicated. And I used to interview people and read books, and some things would be in there, and I think, oh man, that's just going too far for me now. That's crazy. And then months or years later, you come across it again and again and again. And you start to think, well, maybe there really is something to this. And it really challenges your belief system, I suppose. But I suppose it didn't start off with me being an atheist and a hardline materialist or something. I've always had an open mind.
I mean, I think that's where most of us who've come into the subject, we start off with just kind of a nuts and bolts, a reality viewpoint of it. But then the more you experience, not just what you hear, but especially when you start experiencing some of the stuff, it's hard to deny what you yourself have experienced. And I know not everyone gets that because they don't have those experiences. But I can tell you from personal experience that some of the stuff that I thought was way out there, past lives, was something that I absolutely didn't think existed 5 years ago. Because I'm just going to tell you, Simon, I haven't told you yet, but I'm actually a pastor. I'm not a religious person. I'm a spiritual person, and I'm not your typical pastor, as anybody can tell you. But my training taught me that once we die, we go to be with God. And so it was a hard thing to understand, that there were other possibilities, because that was the only one that I was taught. But having been in the community and listening to other people, I started becoming more neutral on it. And over the last couple of years, and then there was an event, which maybe I'll talk to you about later, that absolutely confirmed to me that past lives do exist. Nobody had ever presented it to me in a way that I experienced it. And so that has moved me all the way from the complete skeptic to being neutral to, really believing that past lives do exist. And that's a good transition, Simon. Let me go ahead and ask you this question. Why are you interested in the subjects of near-death experiences and the afterlife? What brought you into this?
Well, when I was a kid, at 10 years old, I'd go to the library and get books out on these things. When I was 10, I'd read anything, if it's UFOs or Bigfoot or ghosts and afterlife stuff. And then it was the early 80s, I read a book by Raymond Moody called Life After Life, which was the first book really about near-death experiences. And he coined that term, near-death experience. And that was a real... I wouldn't say a shock, but it was a sudden thing. You think, holy moly, I didn't know this happened. This is fascinating. And so you get more and more into it. The thing is, in the 80s, there weren't so many books around, but as the decades have gone on, more and more people have investigated it. And I think at the University of Virginia, there was Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was investigating children with past life memories. And now they've got Dr. Bruce Grayson there, who I think it's at least 30 years he's been studying near-death experiences. And so there's so much more research and real scientists and doctors looking at it. And so over time, you become more and more interested, and people who have near-death experiences write their own books. And then you find these verification events in some of them. And that really starts to hook you into it. And I just still fascinated after decades and writing my own book and talking to so many people. There's always something new to learn as well, because it gets so complicated.
Can you go ahead and tell everybody what the name of your book is? I read it earlier, but it would be good for you to go ahead and tell us the name so everybody knows, and tell them where maybe they can purchase it.
Yeah, it's Verified Near-Death Experiences, Proof of an Afterlife, and it's on Amazon worldwide, and you get it in Barnes and Noble and other bookshops. I doubt they'd have it on the shelf though. You'd probably have to go on their website and order it from them.
Can you define what a near-death experience is for everybody? Not everybody might be at the same level here. And so can you describe really what the difference between near-death experience and death itself is?
Well, yeah, there are some people say it's not really a near-death experience because they weren't dead, and they see dead as in being permanently dead. It's that thing of becoming close to death in near-death experience. That's how it originally came from. But as time's gone on, we've found that people in comas could have a near-death experience and then dead. Their body's not dead. And there have been people who get very close to death in that they may be in a car and they know they're going to be in a terrible car crash, and they have the near-death experience before the car crash. It's like somehow their consciousness leaps out of their body or something like that. But there are some people who say near-death experience and think that means it's because they came close to death. There's no spiritual or out-of-body experience. But for me, the definition of it is the very least you have an out-of-body experience. And if it was a car crash, you see the scene of the car crash, probably from up above, maybe 12 or 15 feet, looking down on what's happened after the crash. And then there are other stages that happen, and different people will have different stages, and some can be quite extensive, where they meet spiritual beings, they go to spiritual locations. Some of them are neutral. There are people who have distressing near-death experiences, which can be really horrible. And it's basically it's out-of-body experience, then it can lead into a spiritual experience. And then there's things like the life review and meeting spirit guides, meeting deceased loved ones, and getting a tour. I've got people in my book who were kind of picked up by a spirit guide and given a tour of the afterlife, which was very extensive. And also with the life review, that can be very impactful. There's talk of the tunnel of light, but only 15-20% of people who have a near-death experience have any kind of a tunnel experience.
I've got a question for that one later.
Yeah, some people say that there's a woman who describes it as the blink environment, because you blink and then you're at another location, and somebody else calls that the fog stage. But that's how I'd say near-death experience is at least an out-of-body experience.
Well, that brings up a really good question. I've studied a little bit on remote viewing. I'm not an expert. I've read 3 books and watched a bunch of videos on it, done a little bit of experimenting with it. But one thing that is closely associated with remote viewing is astro travel. And so astro travel is a lot of times as out of body. And so how do we distinguish the difference between a near-death experience and someone who's just like astral travel out of their body, but not near death? Because that, I've talked to people who've literally left their bodies, but there was no near-death experience associated with it. So how do we distinguish between those two, or can we?
I'm not sure if we can. I've talked to people who do have out-of-body experiences, and they know how to do it. They can get themselves to that point. And it's there's a guy called Oliver Tapp, a German, who was at the Monroe Institute and did some courses there on out-of-body experience. And he says that things are different when he has his out-of-body experience, in as much as he had one in his apartment, and he went out of his bedroom and there was a hardwood floor and the walls were blue. But in reality, he's got a carpeted floor and the walls are white. But the rest of the apartment was the same. And I talked to somebody else that said when they are having an out-of-body experience, it's kind of an energetic thing where what you see around you is different to what you would see if you were there physically. He said it's like you could go down the road, and he said this happened. He was on this street and there were these 4 guys sitting on a bench having a beer, and he realized those 4 guys were dead. And he went over to them and talked to them and said, "Why are you here? You could move on. You could go into the light." And those 4 guys will go, "Yeah, but we're having a great time sitting around having a beer. We don't feel like going into the afterlife yet." And with near-death experiences, it doesn't seem to be the same perception. When they're out of body, near-death experiences talk about their perception being so much better than normal waking state. Their eyesight, their hearing, they can think much faster. It seems that the intellect is super speed. And I think that's because they're no longer in some way hooked up to the physical brain, which is slowing everything down, which is kind of reducing consciousness so that you can exist in a physical body. Because, you know, our eyes can only see so much of the spectrum. Our ears can only hear so much sound. Because people, when they're released from their bodies in a near-death experience, talk about seeing colors they've never seen before. No wonder if it's they can see ultraviolet and they can see infrared, which, you know, you can't see with your physical eyes. So I'm no an expert on out-of-body experiences. I have talked to Russell Targ about remote viewing and Courtney Brown about remote viewing, and heard these amazing stories about Pat Price. And that's some amazing stuff. But remote viewing seems to me to be different to out-of-body experiences. But I'm more an expert on near-death experiences.
Yeah. Well, some of them like Joe McMoneagle and Lynn Buchanan, and of course the original Ingo Swann, they, you know, in their books, they talk about it, and it seems to be closely associated with remote viewing. Now, Joe McMoneagle had a near-death experience, I think, where it was pretty hard to deny. It's when the person's physically declared dead. And so what you're saying, if I understand you right, is that a person can have a near-death experience and not have a toe tag put on them or be declared dead by a doctor. Is that the case?
Yeah. Because there's 3 people in my book who had their experiences while they were in a coma, and they didn't die. So yeah, it seems almost. I wonder if you have your spirit guides or there's some spirit team, and you're supposed to be on doing something with your life, and you go way off the path, and they take the opportunity to grab you and get you back on the path you should be on. And if they can work it any way they can, they'll do it. So maybe they can grab you while you're in a coma or when you're close to dying, but you're physically okay.
So I think this, you mentioned being able to see and all that stuff. It brings up my next question. And that is, some people want to ask the question is are we ourselves after we die? And the second part of that question is, will other people be able to recognize us? Because we're not in a physical form anymore, which is, I mean, the question is, how do we see? Because we got human eyes that we see with now. What gives us the ability to see? Is it not seeing like we see with our eyes? Is it just a different way of being able to perceive? And maybe seeing isn't the right word for that. I don't know. We use it because we have human eyes and that's what's normal. Are we ourselves after we die? Will people be able to recognize this? Is the second part of that question.
Yes, in a way. That's a tricky answer. Like with the sight, people say they can see 360 degrees. So they can see behind them, the sides of them, up and down, all at the same moment. And I've asked them, is this overwhelming? And they say, no, it feels perfectly normal. And the other thing about, would people recognize you? I think they do. I think there seems to be a place, it's just guesswork, that with the near-death experience, you're not actually going into the afterlife. You're going somewhere else. That's a kind of, I call it the theater of the near-death experience. It's constructed just for you, and it's tailored just to you for being exactly what you need. And then it seems that perhaps when you die, you go to a space that's to acclimatize you to the afterlife. And you get in that space, and you just, it's like an ideal earth, this space where you are. And you know, in the Matrix, they talk about residual self-image. When you're out of the Matrix, you just look how you look. But when you go into the Matrix, the software there has to find some way of building you, to show what you look like. And so the software takes it out of your subconscious, your residual self-image. And I think it might be the same sort of thing when you go into the afterlife. That is what's built. You subconsciously build that body. And eventually you start to feel that I don't need this body anymore. I'm a spirit, and I could just be a ball of light if I wanted to, or I could look just like Brad Pitt if I wanted to. And then you start moving away from there, and it's like they talk about raising your frequency, and perhaps you start evolving beyond that. And also, there's a thing where, like Chris Bledsoe said, he saw Mary, but it might have been the spirit presenting themselves as that. So it may be if you were to die and your deceased loved ones came to collect you, they may have just been presenting themselves so that you can recognize them. It is them, it's their soul, but they no longer have a body or feel they need one, but they know how to present themselves so you recognize them and you're comfortable. A lot of times people say when they get into that space where they meet their deceased loved ones that they look how they would look in the prime of their life. If they died at 80, they now look 25 or 30 years old and full of
30 is
life
common.
and very fit, that kind of thing. So I think that you probably would recognize people, but it might be because they've chosen to present something that you'll recognize.
Okay, my next question is, and I was watching a video last night. It's got like 25 million views, and the guy was talking about having been declared dead for like 20 minutes, and he went, and somebody was next to him. He couldn't see him, but he knew they were with him, and they took him up to some place, and there was a cloud, and there was an arm that reached out, and the arm told him that it was not his time to go, that he had things to do on earth. And so that really brings up a great question, because I have another friend I asked this very same question about, because she had a near-death experience as well. And I asked her, who decides whether we go on or whether we come back? And she said, we do. And so that was her perspective on it. But then in the video last night, and I've heard this from other people too, that somebody tells them that it's not time. So who really decides whether you come back or whether you go on to death itself?
Yeah, I've heard both sides of that. There's a woman called Pamela Reynolds in my book, and she was with all her deceased loved ones, and then her uncle brought her back to where her body was, and she saw her body, and she was like, no way do I want to return to that. It was on an operating table and it was in a terrible condition. And she says it felt like he pushed her, like she fell into a really icy swimming pool, she said, is how it felt. But there was also a point before that where they said, you have to go back. And she said, I don't want to go back. And they said to her, but you already agreed to it. And she was thinking, no, I didn't. When did I do that? And it's maybe there's your soul point of view and your human point of view, or what they might call the higher self. And it's the higher self that makes these decisions and not actually you and your consciousness. But then there's other times, there's a lady in the book who she dies and she feels fine. And the spirit guide says, but what about your small children? She said, no, they'll be okay. I'll just carry on in the afterlife. But then the spirit guide points out how the father is abusive and can get physically violent, and that there's no grandparents, or that her grandmother is not a good parent either, and that would not be good for her children. So eventually this woman's, okay, all right, I'll go back for the children. And so she kind of did decide to go back. They said, we think you should, but you don't have to. But she did decide to go back. So I hear all sorts of different levels of that, whether it's being pushed to wanting to come back.
Right. One thing that I try to do is I try to stay away from the religious angle on any of these words I use. And I know it sounds strange coming from somebody who's a pastor, but just to give you an insight into how I came into the UAP community, is I decided I've got a master's degree, and I decided to take a bachelor and a master's degree. And I decided to put all my educational training aside, because I knew if I didn't do that, I would be like Bledsoe and some of the others, who everything they understand, it goes through the filter of their religious experience and their religious relationship. And so I tried to put mine aside and just look at things raw. And I realize we all have biases, and I'm not saying that I don't, but I tried to create as much of a clean slate as I could. And so when I research this stuff, when I talk about it, I try to take the religious terminology out of it as much as I can, because I don't want to be biased in my things. And so like even the word reincarnation has a religious connotation to it. And so I like past lives better. I prefer to use that. And so there are some real questions, Simon, about why certain things are the way they are. For example, why do some people go on to another life? They go from a past life into another life. We might call it today the present life. And then there are some other people that are in a ghost state, a spirit state, and they're here. And then and I'm assuming from what you've just discussed, there's at least a third option where you just simply go to a higher plane. And, some people might call that heaven. That might be something they use. Some people might call it nirvana, or something like that. But why these differences? Why is there past life for some? Why are some people in a ghost or spirit state? And then why do some people ascend to the next level and not to the next life, or stay in that spirit state? What's your understanding?
Well, what I've heard, and this is guesswork again, but I've got a lot of information behind it, so it's a good guess, I think, is that when you die, you go to the level in the afterlife which matches your frequency, matches your consciousness, your subconsciousness, your viewpoint. If you're a really
Can I
strong
stop you
Muslim,
for a second, Simon, there? Because I want to clarify what you mean by frequency. I don't want anybody, because we talk about that also when I had Brett Elders on one of my last podcasts, and we talked about the fact of why aliens are not interacting with us openly. And one of the things she said, like the Palladians, their frequency is higher than ours, and they want us to get our frequency up. And so it's the same concept, I think. That's why I want you to define it. But really, when we talked about it and unlocked what the frequency means, it really is about, and I don't want to use the word morality, because morality can kind of be one of those words that people associate with religion, but it's the idea of being a better person, being a better human being. Is that the same deal with frequency, the way you understand it, or is it something else?
yeah, it's hard, isn't it? It's to me, it sort of means the same thing as you'll go to the afterlife level that resonates with you and your subconscious. And
Is it attaining something
frequencies,
though? Is it attaining
it's
something like becoming a better person, kinder, more loving, more graceful, or is it something else?
yeah, I don't think it's like that. That almost sounds like a religious thing, and there's judgment, and you have to be there's good and evil.
Yeah, they don't use
It's like
They don't use it. Well, I guess they could say it that. I guess they could. That's how the Palladians did for Billy Myers. That's how they presented it. And as far as I know, Billy was not a religious person at all. So I don't think that came from his own psyche or anything. But that's how the Palladians. So when you talk about frequency, you're probably using that term differently than the way the Palladians explained it to Billy Myers. Is that true?
yeah, I think probably I use the word frequency because that's what some people who have near-death experiences use that word.
Right.
But it's like I said, it could be what resonates most with you is if somebody's a very strong Muslim, they may go to a space in the afterlife that's just full of Muslim people.
Right.
And they say, yeah, we were right, with regards to Muhammad and Allah. But then the Christian person may go to an afterlife that's just full of Christian people. And then there's people who are just plain nasty, and they'll go to somewhere where it may be just loads of bars and violence and drinking. And but there does seem to be a progression from there in these near-death experiences. There's one guy who's taken on a tour of the afterlife by a spirit guide, and they go to one of these places, and he sees all these people having an awful time, but then the spirit guide helps him raise his frequency. There's that word again. And he realizes that there are these other souls that are coming down and trying to help them and raise them.
Oh.
So those people went to the place that resonated or was their frequency when they died. and
Right.
that they can raise up out of it. But there's also this idea that when your soul incarnates, it's not 100% of your soul. Your soul's just putting a small spark of itself in your life and in other lives, because there's no time in the afterlife. I kind of liken it to a tree, where the tree wood is the soul and the leaves are all the different lives. And as there's no time, your soul is experiencing all of your lives in the same moment, just like a tree experiences all its leaves in the same moment. And now I'm starting to get a bit off track. What was the question? It's about frequency.
About whether there was a morality to it, whether it was different, just to explain what that meant. And so it was, the real question was about, why do some people end up with, at least the last one I asked was, why do some people end up in bodies, reincarnation, whatever you want to call it. I call it past lives, present life from a past life. Why do some people go to be ghost? And then the third option, and I think that's the one you were talking about, was, about what, the next level. And then you just branched out on it. It's what you did, and tried to explain that, from your understanding, from your research, it sounds like people go to where they are most, what resonates with them, what you said their vibration level is, but really what it sounds like is that's where their comfort level is. And it may not be the best place the way you described it, because if it was the best place for them, there wouldn't be people trying to help raise them up if that was the case. And so I think that that's where we were, that's what we were processing. But the ghost are one, I've talked to Margie K about it, and maybe you've heard this too, about why maybe some people stay behind as ghosts or spirits, is because they have unfinished business. And so that's what motivates them to stay. And until that business is taken care of, and that's not every situation, but in some situations that seems to be the case. There's some unresolved issue that they haven't resolved. Until they get it resolved, they're going to stay in that state. But it's just trying to understand, well, why does one person, why does this happen this way to one person? Why does it happen this way to another person? And why do they have the third option where, people ascend, trying to make rhyme or reason about why the different categories, different stages, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I think eventually everybody does ascend and move up the ladder, but you get to a point where you will reincarnate, or it's like your soul will put part of itself into a new body. And so it seems that when it does that, it's not you, Dale, that reincarnates. Your soul is reincarnating, and you stay in that afterlife space with your soul absorbing everything from all the lives that it's living. And that you may die and not go to such a great place, but you will be raised out of it eventually. And, there's, yeah, go on. Sorry.
So I was going to ask a direct question about that. And it's one that I've heard before, about the idea of the next life and the reincarnation. Well, if everybody got reincarnated, there's obviously more bodies now than there were in the beginning. If you go back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, we didn't have like almost 8 billion people. And so where, if it was all reincarnation, where does, unless maybe your analogy of the tree and the leaves, where do all the, does that prove that not every person is reincarnated? Or does that simply mean that people are branching out and they may be a part of their spirit in multiple bodies? Or could it be multiple dimensions that they're in when you talk about the tree and the leaves or branches, whatever you want to call that, where they're part of their souls in each leaf or branch? Could that also be in other dimensions?
Yeah, it gets more complicated, doesn't it? One thing I think is that we can be too focused on the earth and feel like reincarnation, it only happens on earth. And the universe is so big. And I have taken people to past lives on other planets, billions and billions of souls out there, far more than 8 billion. And when they choose at some point to have a life on earth, then that they can come here and have a life if it's right for them. And so I don't see there's any problem with the amount of people physically on Earth and how many souls there are, and how, you know, there's getting more and more. Souls come from everywhere. It may be that you've had past lives on other planets as well, or your soul has. And also, there is one theory with reincarnation that there is a multiverse, and there's lots of Dales out there, lots of Simons in all these different universes, and your soul's experiencing all these different lives where you make different choices and different things happen to you. There's hints of that in places. There's a guy I talked to who's having abduction experiences, and the ET took him to an apartment that was strangely familiar. And he got a glimpse of someone out the corner of his eye, and when he looked round, they weren't there. And this apartment was so weird to him. And he looked at these photographs on the side, and he was in all these pictures, but he didn't know anybody that was in those pictures. And they were all hugging and smiling, and it was like he was living another life. And it seemed like that was a hint of another universe. Also, there's people, when they're in coma, there's all sorts of experiences people have. Some have these terrible, nightmarish, distressing experiences. Some have near-death experience, some out-of-body experiences. I've read about 2 or 3 people who, there was a guy who was coma for, I think, 7 days, but he lived a life of 22 years on another Earth. And when he came out of the coma, he was talking to people about it. The doctors were saying, well, no, it's just dreams, it's hallucinations. But what he said, and what these other people say, is that life is just as real as this one. He had a job, he had an apartment, he'd go home in the evening, have his dinner, watch the TV, he had relationships. He even said he did a tour of duty for a year in a Southeast Asian country that doesn't exist on this Earth.
Right.
And he said there were little bits and pieces that were just slightly different, like the McDonald's signs were different colors to this Earth.
Wow.
And there was a woman who had 7 years in another life, and she got married and had a child. And then she woke up here out of her coma. And for her, she'd lost her children. She'd lost her child. And the people around her were like, yeah, but it was just a dream. Don't get so worried about it. But for her, it was absolutely real. And so there's another hint there of the multiverse and us having other lives in other places.
Yeah. Well, we'll hit on that, the time aspect, in a little bit. I got a question on that. So how could just a short amount of time go by here, and what do you say, 120 years somewhere else? So we'll hit on that in a minute. Now, the one I want to get to now, and you brought it up already, is that many people have experienced the near-death experience, describe seeing a light or a tunnel. And so what's your understanding of the light and tunnel, and why do some people see it and other people don't?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, why some do and some don't. Maybe it's something to do with what they expect to experience if they're in that position. But also, people say it's a tunnel, but they also say the word tunnel isn't quite right, but it's as close as they can get to what they experience. And that the light at the end of the tunnel does seem to be this afterlife space that's incredible, full of love and connection. But also the tunnel experience people describe can be very different. It's not just a tunnel of light or a dark tunnel with a light at the end. I've had people describe a tunnel that's just big enough for them. Others that say the tunnel is enormous and there's other people going up at it. They can hear music in the tunnel. Sometimes they say they see people going back the other way, maybe to reincarnate. There's a guy in my book, for him, the tunnel was an aircraft fuselage with all the seats removed, and the only light was coming in through the windows. And there's a girl in my book, 7 years old. For her, the tunnel was made of transparent bricks, and all the light was coming through the bricks. And the floor of the tunnel was so uneven, she had to crawl to get along it. So
could it be a portal, Simon? Could that possibly be a portal?
I suppose it could be. You might be able to use that word to describe it. But like I say, it's different for different people. Right. And doctors have said, like skeptics, that when you get very low oxygen in your blood, that your peripheral vision shuts down. You get tunnel vision, and so it can look like you're in a tunnel. And they say, well, that explains it. That's the tunnel experience. And it seems absurd to me. It's almost like if you say you went on the subway, you're in New York, you went on the subway, or you're in London, you go on the underground trains, you're in a tunnel. And if the next day you met a friend who was a doctor and said, "Oh, I saw this thing happen while I was down there on the underground train," they say, "Oh, no, that didn't happen to you. You were in bed at home. You just had tunnel vision." It's absurd to tell you you weren't there. You know you were there. That was a real experience.
Yeah, it seems like science is trying to, trying to explain away near-death experiences. And you brought it up earlier with the Alexander doctor you talked about, that these are, when the brain's, because they say that once the body dies, that the brain can still survive minutes, hours, afterwards. And so, but I think the way you explained it and the way I understand it is, just because there's activity in the brain doesn't mean it has the ability to form thoughts and complex thoughts like you were talking about, just because there's brain activity. So this, to me, that it looks like something different. I don't think it's really very scientific what they're doing. And it's the same issue, anything to do with the paranormal, anything to do that's outside of what's known science, outside of that box, they just ignore it. And I don't understand why, because I've always thought science is supposed to be curious. And so it's almost like they've got blinders on and they have this little box they're in. And if anybody steps outside of the box, then it's fringe, then it's conspiracy theory, then it's not scientific, when they've created the box. Whereas science is much broader than they understand. And like I said, if science should be anything, it should be curious. And I just don't understand, Simon, why they're not more curious. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. We're running low on time. Where does consciousness come into all of this?
It seems that consciousness it's like the universe is consciousness. And it's a weird thing to say and difficult to conceptualize. But that's what near-death experiences kind of say, that the prime thing of the universe is consciousness. And they talk about God, or they call it the creator or source. And they say that's also consciousness. And that in the end, we're part of a collective consciousness, and that we're all connected in some kind of a web. People in the near-death experience have described this massive light that they see, and they may be floating in this dark void, and there's this light, and when they focus in on it, they can see individual souls, billions of them, amongst this light, and that there's this incredible interconnectedness, and they can focus in on one of them and they'll connect to them, and they'll know that soul absolutely everything, and that soul knows you absolutely. And it's so this consciousness connecting it all together. But that's like what you might call the big picture. But on the smaller picture, it's an individual thing that we all have. And they say we return to source in the end. It's all about this creator, this God source is trying to gain experience, and it does it by having lives in the physical, because it can't do that itself. And the physical may be on all these different planets, and Earth may be one of these planets. And they say it's a tough school, Earth, but there's other tough schools around, I'm sure. But yeah, that's a real tricky question to answer, that one.
I think maybe an analogy to help people understand it is there's the server, like with the internet, and the internet goes out to the individual computers, and the computers are connected to the server. Could that be the creator, or whatever other words you use for that it's kind of like we're all connected, and then we're also connected to each other somehow. So consciousness is just everywhere, even though we can't perceive it with our eyes.
Yeah, it's because the physical brain just dumps down our consciousness, so we can exist in this physical space.
I was talking to a couple of friends of mine, Ann and Lauren, about the phenomenon of time slowing down and how that might apply to near-death experiences in the afterlife. And the reason that came up, there's a couple of reasons actually, but one was that this Lauren's near-death experience, and she's still trying to sort through all of the different ramifications of it, but she was out with a bunch of other kids, and they were in a lake she could dog pedal, but she didn't really know how to swim, and the wind started pushing her out. Well, about that time, all the kids got called in for dinner, and for whatever reason, either they couldn't hear her struggling, she was asking for help, they all went in. And so she fought it for, a couple of minutes, and pretty soon she started to sink. And she went to the bottom of the lake. In some place of the lake is like 208 feet deep. Now, it probably wasn't as deep as where she was, but she was down there, her estimation, about a minute and a half. And yet, as she described her thinking process, her analyzing, and all the thoughts that came to her, it really felt like she was down there much longer. And then the other thing is, something came and grabbed her and pulled her out of the water and put her on the shore. But to her, I'm guessing 5, maybe 10 minutes at the most had gone by. But by the time she got to the cabin, which wasn't very far away, where all the kids and the moms were staying, all the kids had eaten and they were completely done. And so at bare minimum, those kids maybe even come back and got seconds, but the kids were all done, completely done eating. It had to have been somewhere around 30 or 35 minutes. And yet to her, it was like 5 or 10 minutes. And let me share an event that happened with me, which is the same principle. I was talking to Anne, one of the women I was talking about, and we were on Signal and we were just chatting, and I was sharing one of my experiences with her. And I'd just gotten started. We'd just been on the phone maybe 5 minutes, possibly 10. And all of a sudden she asked me to stop. And when she did, I looked at the screen and it said 43 minutes had gone by. And I'm just absolutely blown away, because it's only been like 5 to 10 minutes. And she hadn't said anything to me, and I didn't say anything to her. And then she said, "Did you catch that, Dale? Did you catch how we've only been talking a few minutes and around 45 minutes had gone by?" And then she told me this, Simon. She said, when I was talking, it felt like she was in a tunnel, and my voice started getting more and more intense. And that's when she stopped me. And so this whole concept of time speeding up, time slowing down, it seems to be real. And to be honest with you, since that event, it's like time has slowed down for me. I mean, it was just screaming by before that event. It's just like weeks and months were just, as you get older, that's normal. But since December 4th, which that happened, it feels like 8 months has gone by, or 9 months. And it's really been 4 or 5 months. I'm shocked at how time feels like it has slowed down for me. And so Margie Kay had also brought this up with people like spirits and ghosts, of how they don't seem to know what year it is. She says she's seen them where they come back and they're asking, well, what year is it? Like, they don't even know. Like, time doesn't exist for them like it does for us. And so what's your understanding of time, of it slowing down, and how it works for us here on Earth? Even though there are some situations like mine where maybe it does slow down or speed up, but how does it look during the near-death experience? How does it look in the afterlife? I think you already said the afterlife, there really is no time, no sense of time anyway, because, eternity or forever, or whatever, is there's no ending to it. And so time has to feel different there. So what's your understanding of this?
Lots of near-death experiencers say they can tell you a series of events that happen to them in that afterlife space, but they might say, but I can't tell you in which order they happened. It kind of felt like they all happened at the same time, or they were different times to when they were happening, but they couldn't really explain it on human terms how it felt. And one thing about hypnosis is, when you're hypnotized, I can do a session with someone for an hour, and I've had this with me, and then you come out of it, you think, well, that was only 10 minutes, but it wasn't. It was a full hour. The perception of time changes when you're hypnotized. And, and then there's people who have time slips as well, that are weird stuff that shows up. I had one myself, I think, where I would drive every morning to the same office for my job, and I would go past my favorite Chinese restaurant, And one day I went past it, and there'd obviously been a big fire, and it was all boarded up, and you could see all the soot up the walls above the windows. And a few days I was going past it and thinking, oh man, I really like that food. Why did that happen? And then one day in the morning, I drove past it and it looked back to normal. I thought, oh, this is great. They fixed it up really quickly. And then in the evening, I'm heading home and it's back looking like it had a fire and the windows are all boarded up.
Wow.
And I think back at that and say, what happened there? What did I see? Because I'm sure I didn't make a mistake there, because I remember distinctly thinking, wow, they've really done that up quickly. It's not like I just glanced at it and then carried on. And other people talk about time slips where I talked to a woman who was at a university and she was working there and she needed to get something out of an office. And she opened the door and went in. And there was a woman on these tall steps going up the shelves, getting a book from high up. And she was dressed in Victorian clothing. And she thought, this is weird. And the woman at the top of the steps got a book out. And the woman I talking to said she looked out the window and the buildings were wrong. There were loads of buildings missing. And she freaked out and left the room. And then went back in and it was back how it should be. And a little later on, like a few weeks later, she saw an oil painting of somebody who used to be a professor there, a woman, and that was the woman she'd seen on the ladder getting the book. So there was a time slip there.
So kind of like time travel then is what you're describing.
Yeah, and there's other people who talked about time slips. I had a story about that, the Conjuring, the house that's in the Conjuring.
Oh yeah.
A woman was in that house and she was going to the kitchen to get something and she just saw all these people sitting at this table having dinner, dressed like it was the Victorian era. And she thought, what is going on here? And then some guy at the table looked up and saw her and said, well, would you look at that? And then suddenly they all disappeared. So it could be like for them, she was a ghost. And for her, they were the ghost. So there's all sorts of weird stuff with time, and I can't explain it.
Well, that really, one of the reasons I did not like the idea of ghosts or spirits, there was a time in my life where, like some people today, you just explain it away. Well, that's demons messing with your mind or whatever. But the root of it was, when I hear about people seeing Civil War soldiers, I'm going like, who would want to stay in that state for, over 100 years? How would you like to exist in that state? But Margie helped me to understand that to them, it doesn't feel like 100 years. It's kind of the reverse of, or maybe it's the same, of that person that was in the coma for, I think you said 7 days, but they lived 120 years somewhere else. And so time was different in that other location. And so, if spirits don't experience time the same way we do, then it isn't like they're stuck. I guess that's the thing that was in my mind is I don't want to be stuck in an existence, for over 100 years. That's like that. It doesn't seem like much of a life from what I've seen with Ghost and the experience, but I'm not on that side either. I'm not actually the one experiencing it, but it does make me feel better that maybe it doesn't feel like over 100 years to them. Maybe it seems like a year. Maybe it seems like 5 years. I don't like the idea of being trapped. And that's, I guess, what bothered me with that. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it can seem a little bit like being trapped. I talked to this guy, Oliver Tapp, who does these out-of-body experiences. And at the Monroe Institute, they taught them how to do something called soul retrieval. And that is getting to find these people who are kind of stuck in just after death and they don't realize they're dead. And he said that he went to this space. There was this woman in this kitchen and it looked like the 1950s and she was stirring the pot. And she didn't see him at first, but eventually she did. And she just says, oh, my husband's not back yet. He's usually back by now. I have to keep stirring the stew so it doesn't solidify. And he said it looked like the 1950s in that kitchen. She could have been there 40 or 50 years. And she didn't know it. To her, it might just seem, oh, my husband's an hour late. But she's been dead all that time. So you're right about that. Seems that some of these spirits have no perception of time passing.
Another question I have, and I'm going to try to rush through, I got 2 or 3 more that I want to get through. One is, when you've researched these people, I mean, you've thoroughly written a book, you've obviously studied this since you were a child, but when these people come back from these near-death experiences, do they ever talk about coming back with like enhanced abilities, like maybe being able to perceive dead people or having some special gift? Because sometimes, like with the alien abduction phenomenon, people may come back, they may have psychic abilities already, but it's like it's enhanced them. And so have you heard any stories of people coming back from near-death experiences where they have a gift, that they didn't have before, or it's been enhanced, whatever the gift might have been?
Yeah, that's something that's interesting. People who have abduction experiences may say they can't wear watches because they won't work, and electronics freak out when they get close to it sometimes, and they have those psychic things happening, and maybe amazing synchronicities show up. And people who have near-death experiences have the same side effects, all of them. So it seems something weird going on there with alien abduction and near-death experiences. There's a crossover. And it's like one of the guys came back from in my book. He was resuscitated, and a little while later, he's lying in his bed, and his family are there. And his deceased aunt shows up, and he's passing on information from her to them. And these people are crying because it's absolutely correct what the aunt is saying. And that does show up. It's psychic stuff. And it's like you say, when they're young, they might be a little psychic, maybe seem to have some medium talent. And then after the near-death experience, it just explodes and becomes much more powerful, just much better at it. So that shows up. And I think it's interesting that it crosses over with the abduction thing.
So that goes to the next question, which is, I think it's an obvious answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's an obvious answer to the question, but do these experiences change people's life? And what I mean by that, in how they perceive reality, how they treat other people, how they look at death itself, does it change them in all those ways?
Yeah, it does. And it can be a really massive change that lasts their whole life. It's, like a skeptic may say, well, it's just hallucinations, but hallucinations don't change people like this.
Right.
70% of people who have a near-death experience get divorced afterwards.
Oh,
And
wow.
there's a part of the near-death experience is the life review that some people have. And in that, you review your entire life, every second of it. But the people say this kind of happens in an instant. There's that thing with time again.
That's
And
interesting,
what you
though.
see is you see how you affect people in your life. So if you were mean to someone, you feel that from that person's point of view in the life review. You feel bad and you see how much you affected that person, how bad you made them feel. And if you've lived 50 or 60 years, most of us are not kind all the time. And you might, in an instant, feel all this terrible stuff you've caused through all these people. And it's a ripple effect. And if you make somebody feel bad, they may go off and just be mean to someone else. And you feel that as well. But you also feel
Sorry.
when you're nice to someone, you feel what they feel. You feel how good that is. And a lot of the time, the people say there's no judgment in the afterlife when you're reviewing your life. You may have your spirit guides with you or spiritual beings, and they'll have their arm around you. They'll be saying, don't worry, I'm with you. I'll back you up on this. And it's you that judges yourself and your behavior. And I think that can be really impactful, really powerful. And when people come out of this and they're resuscitated, that changes them a lot. Also, people become very spiritual, a lot less materialistic. They may have been a big career, have a lot of money, a big house, great holidays, a great car, and they come back from the near-death experience and none of that is important anymore. They don't want to know about the money. It's about other things. And I think that's why people might get divorced, because if you come back and say to your partner, I don't want to do that stuff anymore. And your partner be like, hang on a second, I like the money. I like the big house. What do you mean you don't want this anymore? So you could see how they might cause a divorce.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you and follow up with you about it. 'Cause that 70% is a high number. Is what was it that motivated them? Because you probably know who Yvonne Smith is. She is a hypnotherapist. In case you don't, she deals with experiencers and abductions and things like that. And I've had like 4 sessions with her. But in one of our discussions, we were talking about how sometimes, and she mentioned it through in her books and also in our discussion, that whoever the ETs or aliens are, that they tend to have a purpose for someone's life. And once they can actually cause people to be broken up, and they can be cause for people to come together and stuff. So I found it interesting that you mentioned the divorce rate, but it sounds like in what you're saying is there's not an outside force controlling that. It's just the person has changed, and the person that they are married to isn't willing to change with them. And so they realize that there's an imbalance there. And so they realize they can't accomplish the life they want to live as long as they're married to somebody who's going to keep trying to pull them into this materialistic world. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm reminded of a guy called Howard Storm. Have you heard of him? He
No.
was a professor of art in a university in the United States, and he had taken a group of students to Europe to go around these incredible art galleries. And they got to Paris, and he had this terrible problem with his stomach. They found out later that part of his stomach had ruptured, and it was leaking stomach acid into his abdomen.
Wow.
And he was in so much pain in this hospital in Paris. And it was a weekend, and it was a small hospital, and they couldn't find a surgeon. The doctors had all gone on holiday. And so he was dying there. And he suddenly found himself standing next to his bed, feeling fine. And he looked down, there was a body in his bed. He thought, who the hell is this? And why is my wife ignoring me when I'm talking to her? And then he heard some voices from the hallway that said, come on, Howard, time to go, time to go. And he thought, it must be time for my operation. And he went into the hallway. There's these people there. And they said, down this way. And they're walking down the hallway. And he starts thinking, I don't remember the hospital being this big. This hallway goes on forever. And as they were going on, it was getting darker and darker. And he started to get worried about this. And he said, I wanted to go back. I'm going to go back to the room. And they started pushing and shoving him and swearing at him and telling him, no, you're coming with us. And they pushed him down the hallway to eventually it was complete blackness. Couldn't see a thing. And they attacked him. And these may be lost souls, perhaps, or, their resonance or their frequency is low. And they really beat him badly. And he was on the floor, so torn up by this. And he heard a voice in his head that said, pray. Now, he was an atheist. He said to me, he was an aggressive atheist. And he didn't know how to pray. He didn't know any prayers. And he was struggling. And he started reciting Shakespeare. And he even recited a TV commercial. But then he remembered the Lord's Prayer, and he started saying it. And these people around him started backing off and swearing and shouting him, telling him to stop it. But the more he said this prayer, the more they went away. So he was saying it over and over. And this light appeared above him and came down, and these hands scooped him up and took him into the light. He said this was Jesus that picked him up. And I said to him, how do you know it was Jesus? He goes, oh boy, if you're there, And so, to cut a long story short, when he came out of this near-death experience, he went to seminary and became a pastor. And that changed him so much. And now that's, the rest of his life since his near-death experience. He's a pastor in a church.
Not that I had a near-death experience, but that's how I ended up going into ministry. But I kind of look at my life and realize that everything I've experienced has been leading me up to where I am today. Even my religious education, it taught me how to think, by going to Bible college and seminary, critically think, and taught me how to speak, and just pretty much equipped me for what I'm doing today. And so I think that most people need to realize that every bit of the stuff that's happened in your life, none of it should be wasted. And usually if you are open to it, that there is a course for your life. You may not follow it. You may not obey whatever that course is, but I can tell you, if you look back, you're going to see that you were being guided in some way. I know I was anyway. Simon, we're basically out of time, but I wanted to go ahead and give you a few minutes in case there was something that we did not cover that you feel is really important that you think we need to discuss, or to, once again, promote your book or your podcast if you want.
Yeah, well, you just, you reminded me about this thing about being on a path. In reincarnation, there's this idea that you plan your life before you're born, and that you're part of a soul group, and you sit down with all these people in the soul group, these other souls, and you say, "Okay, I will need to live the life where these things happen." And it's almost putting on a play where they all got the script, and somebody says, "All right, I'll play the part of your father," and somebody's, "I'll be your mother," and all this kind of thing. But there's also this idea that you're getting nudges on your path. You could call it a spiritual path. And I think about my life where I was reading all these books and fascinated by it. And then I started having my own experiences, like when I was taken through a past life regression, or like in 1993, where I had a close up sighting of a UFO. And then I had these psychic experiences, which I don't control. I wouldn't say I'm a psychic. And then I had another UFO sighting. And then during a past life regression, when I was hypnotized, and we were looking for past lives, that's what we were doing.
Right.
I suddenly had this memory come up of an alien abduction experience. And I was on
Wow.
this table with these greys around me and, the kind of stuff that happens there. And I wonder if that was given to me, that when I saw a UFO, they wanted me to see them. It was like they're giving me a nudge saying, pay attention to this. There's more to the universe. And then when I have my psychic flashes, they're given to me to move me down that path. And maybe that's what's happening to all of us. They know what you need to move you down your path. And you get these little paranormal experiences. I could tell you all the ones I've had, and there are a few. It might sound like I have them every couple of weeks, but actually it's every 4 or 5 years, something will show up that's really powerful. And I wonder if what they wanted me to do was to become a communicator and have a podcast and write a book. And
Right.
maybe that was the plan from the start.
Yeah. The synchronicities are so important, at least for me, because I had stuff happen when I was a child, but I didn't put all the pieces together. I knew because of this reoccurring dream where I experienced pain that there was something that had happened in that situation. It was traumatic, but it was through a series of synchronicities, psychic events, alien sightings, weird craft hovering over my house, mysterious situation where all of the ants in my office died instantaneously. They all died at the same time in place, and there was no trauma on any of them. They looked alive. I have pictures of them, but they were all what I believe were signposts pointing me back to Coachella when I was age 6. And then when I started looking into it, then I found out more stuff that I didn't even know about, like my sister hearing a craft humming and looking up was like a low hum, and there was something up above the duplex, and it was literally blotting out the stars where you couldn't see the stars. It was covering the opening that she could see through, so she couldn't even tell what a shape it was. But there was a bunch of stuff that came through that, and and then Margie Kay asked me the question. She came on my podcast as well, and she asked me the question, well, why now? And I think, it just when it comes to alien abduction or experiences, whatever you want to label it, that there's a timing on that. And when things are supposed to happen, that's when they happen. This was an awakening. So I wouldn't just be a person talking about it, but I'm talking about it with a person who's had experiences, and they've done nothing but increase over the last 2 years. I mean, it's crazy, the stuff that's happened. I'll talk to you about some of that when we get off camera, but it's definitely, there's no question, at least in my life, and I assume in a lot of lives, where we have a purpose. And it's not just being good people. That's important. But sometimes there are roles that we are put in position, and we're supposed to fulfill those roles. We've got a mission, as some people say. But anyway, I sure appreciate you being on the podcast, Simon. It's always good to meet a new friend. And that's one of the things that tends to happen when I do podcasts. I end up making friends, and we talk later on. So I really hope we can do that. I've got lots of friends in the UK. So I'm hoping we're able to do that. So thank you for being on the podcast, Simon. I sure appreciate it. And to everyone else, I just want to remind you, you've made it all the way to the end of the podcast. And I want to tell you how much I appreciate that. And since you've made it this far, it's obviously that there's something in this podcast and this channel that's appealing to you. So can you help the channel out by going ahead and hitting that subscribe button? You can also, like I said before, you can help us out with the YouTube algorithm by going ahead and hitting that like and share button, and that'll help quite a bit. Anyway, I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Open eye, feel the waves cut through me, hypnotized by the sounds I'm breathing in. Hold tight, chemicals collide. Hold tight, hold tight, hold tight. Dripping lights paint the sky.